Okay, hello, happy New Year. Scott Campbell here, Captain Yankee-Jock. Hope you're all well. I just thought I'd try this video thing because I don't have much time to write at the moment. I'm busy finishing up a training course for a yachting school and putting a bid on a big contract for somewhere else. So yeah, apologies for long-time subscribers. I haven't been posting much, I don't think, since December. We spent a few weeks in the US, so South Carolina and Florida. So it was a bit rough coming back to Scotland when it was coming from sort of 70 plus degrees Fahrenheit back to sort of 6 inches of ice on the ground and about 17 Fahrenheit. So like minus 6 or 7 for over a week. So bit of a shock. Um, but yeah, so I've been asked by some clients and some friends yesterday what's happening in Panama. So for those who don't know, I am a merchant navy officer in the UK and freelance marine surveyor. I've been working offshore for 20 odd years now in consulting. Um, so basically, my history with Panama, I've transited the canal a number of times. I've sailed with Panamanian officers for months who were very professional and I became friends with. Um, a couple of good mentors from Panama, to be honest. And I helped a previous employer of mine write an atlas on the Panama Canal. And during that time, I spent a lot of time researching the canal. I've published articles on here. I've published articles on LinkedIn about the Panama Canal. So I'm a big fan of the canal. I've met a lot of people in the canal from different political persuasions, different perspectives on the history of the canal. And spent a lot of time with them and transited a number of times in the cruise lines and uh, went back and spent a bit of time with the pilots transiting the canal. So very familiar with the canal, a little bit familiar with Panama history and US history. So uh, what's Trump talking about? Okay, so I'll get the exact quote here, but essentially he's vowed to take back control of the canal. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, so Trump's made two claims. Number one, that they built the canal. Okay, that's debatable, but it's complicated. And uh, number two claim is that China controls the canal. Now, that's quite a strong claim, so we'll talk about that. Okay, so for those who don't know the geography of the canal, uh, it runs on the Atlantic side from the north, south, and east, and comes out on the Pacific side in the south. The country of Panama sort of spans east to west, so it connects Central America with South America in a sort of east-west direction. All right, so it's quite a confusing um, geography because you think Atlantic is on the east, and Pacific is on the west, but in Panama, Atlantic is north and Pacific is south. All right, we think of South America as being south naturally, and in fact, it's east. Okay, so when the US was fighting the Vietnam War, they actually had a little area near Cristobal where they would drop all the US Army Special Forces guys for their navigation training because navigating in that sort of enclosed jungle where north, south, east, and west are so easily confused was one of the most challenging sort of navigation exercises. So that's a little historical tidbit. That's where they used to train special forces navigators in for Vietnam. All right. So what's happening in Panama? Okay, well, there's a couple of things. did the United States build the Panama Canal? Kind of. It's complicated. Okay, so initially, the original route was created by the Spanish Empire in the 1500s, the early 1500s. They were the first to attempt a canal. Everyone died. And what they actually created was a sort of mule track, and they created a road from the Pacific side to the Atlantic side. And this was done with sort of Spanish conquistadors and local native indigenous tribes and pack mules, that kind of thing. Um, Obviously, back in those days, tropical disease was a problem, and it was a very hard environment for Europeans. All right, the technology didn't exist to build the canals uh, for hundreds of years. So for hundreds of years, Spain operated this trade route. Okay, and they used to bring all the gold from the Spanish Empire, from South America, from California and the West Coast, back to Spain through this route. So it was incredibly strategically important, and basically all the goods that traded in the world, they sort of went across this with the Spanish, or they had to go around Cape Horn, which was incredibly dangerous uh, due to severe weather that far south. Okay, and it's quite an inhospitable coastline, still is to this day. Okay, so Panama has for 500 years been a center of global trade. Um, so the population in Panama has always been very diverse, and a sort of mixed ethnicity population. Fast forward 300 years, canals start to get built in the industrial age, and so in the UK, the US, the French built the Suez Canal, etc. So canal building sort of came hand in hand with Western industrialization. Uh, but still, Panama at the time was controlled by Colombia, so it was just a territory that was part of Colombia. So at the time, the rock star canal builders in the world was Ferdinand de Lesseps from France, who built the Suez Canal. He was going to be the guy in the 1800s who was going to build this canal finally for the Colombians, and it was a complete disaster. They showed up. In contrast to Suez, Suez was built in the Egyptian desert across Sinai Peninsula, so there had been sort of canals there in ancient Egyptian times, so it was already established. Environment's very arid, dry, so there's no tropical disease, no standing water, no mosquitoes, and the geology is very solid rock and sand. So it's just a simple case of excavation, and it's a sea level canal. So there's no locks up or down on Suez. It's just the same level. All right. Panama, by contrast, is sort of quite high above sea level, so that's why we have the locks to stage the vessels up to a canal that's way above sea level. So engineering wise, it's a very different challenge. The French corporation completely failed. Everyone died of disease and landslides, so the geology is very unstable, and it's especially in the south of the Panama Canal. Uh, there was a lot of mudslides, landslides, that kind of thing. All right. So in the 1700s, 1800s, they built a railway, and all sort of attempts to build a canal had failed until that point. So the railway would go up from Panama City, up sort of halfway, up to where Gatun Lake is now, but it's the Chagres River back then. And the US had the gold rush in California. Okay, so they had massive gold exports, and it was much more cost effective to bring the gold south by ship to Panama City, offload it onto trains. The trains would take it up to the river. They put it onto riverboats, steamboats, and take that to the Atlantic side so it could go up to New York, etc. Now, that's essentially the history of US imperialism. This is when America started to get wealthy. Uh, Remember, the British Empire was still the sort of main empire at the time. the French were strong. But the US, a number of times, they had these huge gold shipments. They would be guarded by US Marines. Uh, and a number of times in the 1850s and so on, there were local riots. There was a lot of civil unrest under the Colombian government. And I think three, four, five times there were riots and robberies where essentially the US government security forces guarding these gold shipments had to sort of defend the gold shipments, and they ended up killing rioters and so on, civilians in what was Colombia, in the territory of Panama. So that created this huge pressure for the US to um, take over the railroad, which the Colombians refused. And then they said, okay, well, purchase the canal assets from the failed French attempt at the canal. And I think it was Woodrow Wilson who did that. They authorized it, the funds for that. They purchased all the land and the assets from the failed attempt at the canal. By this time, you're getting to the late 1800s, early 1900s. The US had invented DDT, so they could effectively take over a 20-mile strip either side of the canal, and they just bleached the jungle, essentially sprayed the entire jungle in this area with DDT, and that sterilized all the standing water, killed all the mosquitoes, and stopped the workers being overcome with malaria. And that's how the US were able to build the canal. There were still fatalities, a lot of fatalities. I think Trump quoted it in his speech, that so many thousands of lives were lost. That's true. Okay, so I think the statistic is there were 500 lives lost for every kilometre of canal built during the original construction. So when you sail over the canal and you think about that, it is quite harrowing. You sort of feel the cost of human life, as if you can feel it. If I'm not saying you feel the ghosts, but you can feel the weight of it. So that's about 1,000 people per mile, 800 people a mile if you're imperial. So yes, okay, the U.S. Panama Canal Construction Corporation was funded by U.S. taxpayers. That was from 1903 to sort of 1914. So the first ship that actually went through the canal was on the day that World War One started. So the opening of the canal didn't get much press at the time, but I think they were the first ship to go through. It was an American ship. I could be wrong on that. So did the US build it? Well, kind of. The the complication here is that, as I said, this was Colombia. Uh, the Panamanians rebelled against the Colombians, and the reason that the nation of Panama exists as a separate nation state from Simon Bolivar's Colombia is because the US sent warships down to support rebels to break away from Colombia. Okay, so it was the early stages of American gunboat diplomacy, American imperialism, around the same time as when they took over Hawaii, with the same thing where you had private US investors purchasing land, and then the US Marines sort of intervening, let's say, to overpower the pre-existing sort of government. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's what government is. All right, government is the use of force, and I think people forget that when we talk about politics, that we're talking about how to use force. Um, so that's what happened I think in the 1850s, 1860s. So Panama becomes a separate nation, and when they make the nation of Panama, it's this east-west country, but the US basically own a territory straight down the middle that cuts the country almost exactly in half. And this is sovereign US territory. It was the US canal zone. They had American flags, American law, American, judiciary, jurisdiction, everything. Um, they used local native workers, and they also used imported workers from the Caribbean. Now, the wrinkle is that they had racial segregation in this Panama Canal zone. So the white people and the North Europeans, so essentially the American white people and any North Europeans who came to work on the canal, were paid on the gold standard, and any native Panamanians, darker skinned Indians or Caribbeans, black people, uh, as they saw it, were paid on the silver standard. And I've met some of the old timers who grew up under that system. They all lived in the Panama Canal accommodation, so it was all company housing, company shops. The only stores you could go to were the commissary, like a sort. It was a very militarized culture within the zone, and they literally had segregation in the store. So if you wanted to buy food, the white people went to the gold standard shop and they spent gold standard money, and the black people went to the silver standard shop and they went to the silver commissary. And it was that way until the civil rights movement in the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s. So, on the positive side, for the Panamanians, they have their own country and they have a canal which is the backbone of their economy. On the negative side, it completely bisects the geography and disunites the country. It causes a lot of logistical problems. And there were only two bridges, one at the north, one at the south, and the entire territory was controlled by the US. So half of the country of Panama had to go through what is officially the US border control to get to their friends and neighbors and family on the other side. Okay, so that was a cause of resentment, as well as the racial segregation and allegedly poorer treatment of the workers. And given how many thousands of workers died, it's understandable. All right. Uh, so civil unrest, 1950s, 1960s. The US government at that time was a bit more heavy-handed in how they dealt with unrest, and there were various people that were called rioters who have a sort of martyr-like status now in the history of Panama, who were sort of civil rights leaders, the way they see it, and they were killed in some of these riots. So that led to the pressure that Jimmy Carter faced, and he, in 1979, put in a plan that said, okay, if you can meet these standards over 20 years, we will hand control of the Panama Canal over to Panama, but not the nation state of Panama. Okay, so the Panama Canal Authority, ACP in Spanish, is completely separate from the Panamanian government and the Panama flag. Okay, so Panamanian ships have nothing to do with Panama Canal. It's a separate authority. The Panama Canal is a massive corporation. They manage all the water and all the tributaries and all that feed into the canal. Okay, the water management, the locks, the infrastructure, the pilots, the tugboats, the dredgers are all controlled by ACP, and the training and the safety is their responsibility. Okay, in terms of responsibility, they're fantastic. Okay, the board members are appointed for I think 15 years. They're famously good decision makers. Their safety record is second to none. Okay, Allianz, I think that's how you say it. Allianz, a big insurance underwriter, did a study years back. They compared the Kiel Canal with the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, and the safety record of the Panama Canal is absolutely, they had about a third of the incidents and near misses that Kiel Canal has, and compared to Suez, they're just the safest, by far the safest canal operators. And considering that merchant shipping is notoriously hazardous. Their safety record is amazing. Now, I've met some of the sort of senior management and tugboat masters and pilots on the canal, and they're very, very, very proud of this safety record. Um, and it's really tied in with Panamanian sort of national pride that for the 20-year transition from 79 to 99 that they were able to prove to the Americans that we can do this and we can do it better than you and better than anyone. And their training centers are world class, and they keep very high standards. All right. Of course, there's problems. Nothing's perfect, but they can do it as well as the Americans. That's for sure. Now, uh, military force. Okay, halfway through that transition period, the US didn't like what was happening with Noriega and drug money and things like that. So the military were deployed in Panama halfway through back in 1989. Ostensibly, that I think that was Bush Senior, and that was Bush Senior's idea of a successful regime change where they took out an authoritarian dictator and put in place a democracy now friendly to the US. So some say this is a bit of a unfortunate success in the mind of George Senior, Bush Senior, that maybe led him to have excessively high hopes in Iraq and later on his son in Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, Panama Canal is, Panamanian society. Okay, there's extreme poverty, but it's a Catholic country. They have broadly Christian values. They see women as human beings. They see the human race as one thing. Okay, and not very tribal. Quite a diverse ethnicity and quite a modern country. So uh, you could argue that they were ripe for democracy, whereas that maybe gave false confidence to American imperialists sort of later on. All right, so it's a success story with a different context that didn't apply to the Middle East. All right, so that's all I'll say on that. Uh, and it's complicated because there is resentment against the states in Panama, but as I said, Panama exists because of the states, and there's a lot of very pro-US sentiment, and particularly with Trump. Okay, so you're Latin American Catholic guy. There's quite a macho culture and quite conservative traditional values. So they're very much against the transing of the children, and they like a strong leader, and they respect hierarchy and so on. So they're quite a realistic, tough bunch of people, and a lot of them had a lot of respect for Trump, who'd spent a lot of money in the country prior to that. Okay, so yes, there's resentment at the gold and silver standard and the racialism and the dominance of the US. But how does that affect us today? All right, so the last 20 years has been crazy. So once Panama took control of the canal in 1999, uh, the US sort of reluctantly realized, oh, we have to let this go. They've met all of the standards, and they don't like Jimmy Carter. They saw it as their territory, and they weren't too happy. There was a bit of a debate: should we really give it to them? Back in 1999, they did. Um, and in the early 2000s, they expanded the canal. Now, this debunks Trump's theory, really, that they built the canal, because the canal, since the 2000s, has effectively doubled in capacity. So the Panama Canal extension, so they call it the Neo Panamax extension, so the third lane, if you like, where the ships have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This comes to the economic war with China. So since China entered the world economy in the 90s, they were able to throw sort of state subsidized shipyards, state subsidized steel and materials, near slave labor, and a massive population to enter into shipbuilding. Okay, and since then, China has gone from insignificant in world trade to absolutely dominating all new build shipping. I think it's more than 50% of tonnage is made in China. Okay, uh, massive influence in the shipping world. All right, um, this was sort of clear, especially in the container shipping trades by the early 2000s. Okay, so when they were building this expanded canal, sort of 2008 time, container rates were sort of 10 grand, 12 grand to send a shipping container from China to US. Uh, Look at now, China's building these mega ultra large container ships. They're 400 meters long. They can carry 24,000 containers. So that economy of scale, that gets the cost of shipping a container from China to Europe or the east coast of the US down to like $2,000 a container, 2 or 3 thousand, from tens of thousands. Okay, um, but that was actually a problem for the canal. So when they financed this expansion, it was based on container shipping rates being really high. And midway through construction, I think after the great financial crash, they were okay for a few years, but I think 2012 to 2014 rates dropped massively. Um, and then they were not sure, should we halt construction on the canal or not? And they decided to press on, but certain, decisions were made that maybe they wouldn't have made during the construction of the canal if they had more certain world markets and shipping. Again, a lot of pro-Trump sentiment happened in 2016 when he legalized LNG imports. Demand for the canal for LNG went through the roof. Okay, so exporting LNG from the US saved the canal expansion. So again, there was a lot of very pro-Trump sentiment because that sort of saved the economy of the canal and by extension the country. All right, uh, and again, you can see the popularity of Biden decline in that same time. However, China's been a lot more consistent. Okay, so Chinese companies are not taking over the canal, but the ports at either end of the canal, Chinese-owned companies have massive long-term leases in the cargo infrastructure, berths, and shipping. Um, so they don't control the canal, but they have massive influence. Okay, so that gets us to the sort of the two sort of questions. Why is Trump sort of doing making Panama an issue at this early stage in his presidency? Okay, quite aggressively. Number one, the Darien Gap. Okay, so the east of Canada, east of Panama, sorry. Uh, they have something called the Darien Gap. So there's the Pan American Highway that goes from Canada and the Rockies all the way down the west coast of the states through Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, etc., through Panama, and then from Colombia all the way down to the very tip of South America, except for one gap that's not connected, and it's in the east of Panama, where the country connects to South America. And if you look it up on Google Maps, the end of the road on Google Maps actually says the end of safety because this is not controlled by any nation state. This is controlled by cartels. Okay, it's just jungle, national park, native, indigenous hunter gatherers, and just over the border, the nearest big city is Medellin in Colombia, which is, as you probably know, is controlled as a big drug cartel hub of activity. So that where Panama ends, cartels begin. Okay, uh, Chinese influence. Okay, so the Chinese are supporting the infrastructure of the canal. They've been very consistent. 2007, the president of Panama cut ties with Taiwan, ended diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and switched them over to People's Republic of China. Um, because of the influence and the money that the Chinese are spending in the country. Okay, uh, the the Obama administration really neglected Panama at the same time. Okay, so the Chinese, they don't control it, but they have a huge influence. All right. If you follow Brett Weinstein at all, he's done some good work where they've gone down to the Darien Gap and they're just sort of walking around. What's going on here with this migrant crisis? Are these refugees? Are they economic migrants? And what you'll find there is there's actually thousands and thousands of Chinese migrants, military age males, coming across with all kinds of contraband. And he sort of questions them, where are you going? And they just sort of laugh. You know, everybody knows they're going to the US um, through this undocumented route under Joe Biden's sort of open border policy. Now, uh, you can look at Brett Weinstein's work for that. I think Jordan Peterson covered it as well. Um, if you have open borders, obviously your enemies are going to take advantage of that. I just don't know what to say about that. So the real reason that Trump's talking about the canal is when these people come across from Colombia through the Darien Gap. Remember, the canal cuts the country in half, and there are only two bridges. China's building a new bridge. Yes, it's very good for even America because this new bridge is higher, so it's going to allow larger ships through the canal, and the largest cruise ships will now be able to go. On the surface, it's good for business, good for everyone, win-win. Except, how are these undocumented, illegal, military-age Chinese citizens crossing the canal and getting up to North America? I don't think they're using boats, so they're walking across a bridge, and that's soon going to be a Chinese bridge. So that's really the question I think that he's getting at. Uh, so is there a threat to shipping there, and is there a chance of military action? Well, I think yes, probably military action. Probably on the Colombian side at the border or Darien Gap. So I don't think it'll affect any Panamanian citizens because it's not a controlled territory really. And I think it'll be sort of special ops action. So I don't, special forces. I don't think will be a threat to shipping in any way. So I don't see any interruption in the canal. Sanctions and tariffs on the Chinese. I don't think it'll affect the canal. The canal is just too important globally. So if there's any gap that the Chinese leave, it'll be filled by someone else. It's too valuable. It's such a part of the network of global shipping that it's just not going to be left neglected for too long. And then I think the other thing is we can't forget the Panama Papers. All right, so it's a long time ago now, but 5-6 years ago when they were sort of really going after Trump in this sort of lawfare thing, there was a thing called the Panama Papers where a Panamanian law firm was hacked or breached or leaked thousands of or hundreds of thousands of documents about shell companies that were used for tax evasion or, as I like to call it, tax avoidance, kind of legal. And this was used as a way to sort of get at Donald Trump generally. Now, he had a nice hotel there, which I stayed at. It was like a Hilton or something when I stayed there. It was effectively seized from his management. He didn't own the hotel. It was the Trump Ocean Hotel or something like that, Trump Tower in Panama City. And effectively, he didn't own it, but what it was like a franchise. Like he would lease his name as a brand to various hotels around the world. Other people risked the capital to build the hotel, and then he got the contract for management. So he had a LLC in Panama managing this hotel, and then one day the police show up and there's a standoff for sort of 10-12 days where he's just evicted. They claim unlawfully from this multi-million-dollar management contract that they had, without any sort of recourse or appeal or anything like that. So he effectively had a hotel company seized from him by the government of Panama, which is separate from the governance of the canal. Okay. Now, I don't know about you, but that would piss me off. So I think there's probably an element of grudge as well with the government of Panama, and I think there's a moment being had in a back room somewhere where they go, "Oh no, he's back in charge." Okay, so if you've read Art of the Deal, or you've watched Trump in his first presidency, he likes to start with these, you know, wild, excessive demands, and use fear, posturing, everything to set your anchor price of your worst case scenario really high. And then when he comes in and he asks for what he actually wants, which is probably border control and US franchises in the canal over China, it seems reasonable by comparison. Okay, and that's really how you're going to get US imperialism, that style of imperialism. Okay, so the war between China and the US is economic. What can we do in the West and in the US particularly? Number one, deal with the Jones Act. Okay, China dominates shipbuilding because it's near enough impossible to build ships. Scotland built almost all the ships in the British Empire. Now we can't even build a ferry. It's taken us 10 years to launch a ferry. Um, Destroyed by unions, destroyed by health and safety, destroyed by inflation, destroyed by making energy and industry so expensive, destroyed by the massive loss of population in World War One and Two. Okay, US is the same. They have the Jones Act, deeply protectionist. That's why the US only has about 100 ships under its flag, 100 or something like that. For a size of economy that they have is just insane. So they have to deal with the Jones Act. It's too expensive to build ships in the States and to crew them. Uh, what else? Yeah, the Chinese are building a bridge and they're running the terminals. There's other things the US can spend money on that would be a win-win. Okay, so the water management. So sometimes there are droughts I've written about before. There's a lake to the east where there's plenty of fresh water. When the US initially built the first canal, the pump only goes to about a third of the depth of the lake. If they extended that pump suction to the deepest part of the lake, that would massively improve the operation of the canal. The US have the expertise in the capital. They could fund that. I'm sure that would buy them some influence in Panama. The mules, so in the Neo-Panamax locks, there's no locomotives that drag the ships through, so they have to have a tug attached for the full transit, so that you've got a tug at a cost, uh, of thousands for each ship, attached for 12 to 16 hours, even longer, um, for the full transit of the canal, for particularly for LNG carriers and so on. They might have up to 4 tugs attached. In the old locks, they had locomotives that drag the ships through, and that reduces the operation time of the tugs massively. Okay, and it's a lot safer. Um, so if they wanted to fund that and bring the engineering expertise to that, I'm sure that would be a win-win with the canal authority. That would help solve some of their labour issues as well with the tugs. And in the north, Gatun locks, the Neo-Panamax locks, there's no pier there for the ships to come alongside before they go into the lock. Okay, so they just have to aim straight at the lock. But when their ship's coming out, sometimes they'll have to wait for hours and hours and hours with a tug, or two or three, 4 tugs attached. And that tugboat skipper, he's driving the whole time. He can't go to the bathroom for sort of 4 hours. So this is a source of a lot of disputes in the canal. If any country has the expertise to build a deep water pier in place, it's probably the US. I'm sure that would be a way. And infrastructure like bridges, I'm sure would be welcome in Panama. So uh, threat to shipping, I don't think so. Um, Trump simplifying an issue too much, yeah, that's probably what it is. Okay, it's probably negotiation and by exaggeration. All right, Chinese control, you know, influence and control are different things. All right, so I wouldn't panic. There's other things, but yeah, there is an economic war between the West and China. How are we going to deal with that? You know, um, all I can say is I'm happy Biden's out. I don't think Trump's a saint, uh, but it's better than it was. Um, and I think there's an opportunity for win-win, um, and I don't think it's going to be gunboat diplomacy. And I think they're probably just going to print and tank the currency to oblivion anyway. I mean, 80% of US dollars were printed in the last 5 years. I don't think Trump's going to stop that. I think it's going to continue. Uh, Inflation was crazy this time when we were in the States at Christmas. I couldn't believe how, you know, $3 sandwiches were now $15 compared to sort of 2, 3 years ago. It's just out of control. And I don't see that getting better under Trump, to be honest. So, uh, okay, that's it for me. Let me know what you think of this format. Sorry, I haven't had time to write recently. I've started a bunch of articles that just end up getting deprioritized. So, apologies for long time subscribers. Welcome to the new people. I think you've probably seen me through notes and just added me. So, uh, thanks for that. All right, comment, share. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Happy New Year again, if I didn't say that.